First time I watched Blade Runner, I was in college. I was in my freshman year of college, and I saw it on VHS on a very small television screen in a viewing room at my university's library. And because of the way old VHS pan and scan technology worked, I was really only watching about half the movie in terms of its total screen area, perhaps even less than half. But enough showed through that half to let me know that this was not just a story, but that around the story there was a whole world that felt quite vast and real and mysterious, although in some ways also familiar and like other worlds that I already knew. And I found myself rewatching the film on this old grainy VHS tape just because I wanted to get to know that world better. It was one of the first films I watched where I really felt that I had to get to know the world before I could really understand the meaning of the story.
So Philip K. Dick is a 20th century American short story writer and novelist. The way he changed the genre of science fiction in general is in elevating it from pulp fiction to high literature. He was one of the first science fiction authors to really start to delve into the most fundamental questions that all literary authors do. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? These kinds of questions. He, along with Kurt Vonnegut in the 50s, 60s, 70s, were transforming the genre of science fiction from something that was very much just fun to read because it was about aliens and people in spaceships, to something that was both fun to read and made you think at the same time.
Philip K. Dick was one of the transformative writers of the 1960s who was part of that trend I mentioned, that's the new wave, where science fiction becomes newly interested in uncertainty and newly interested in the interiors of characters who are themselves uncertain. Dick was the first person to bring noir over into science fiction. It's there in his book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which obviously inspired Blade Runner, and it's there in a number of his other stories where a hard-boiled sense of uncertainty on the part of the protagonist that clearly comes from noir is put in a science fiction context where it can then do new, interesting, or radical work. A great line from the science fiction theorist Carl Friedman that helps to define science fiction is that science fiction is about difference, and it's about the difference that difference makes. We know that we're near a science fiction story when some difference has been introduced into that story that makes the world of the story different from the world that we know. And we need that other part as well. We need the difference that difference makes in order for something to work powerfully as science fiction. That new thing that has entered that world needs to actually be transformative in some way. It can't just become a mere prop or costuming. So, to state it in an extreme fashion, if you stage Hamlet with laser guns and spaceships, but the laser guns and spaceships don't make any difference and it's basically just Hamlet with unusual costumes and prop choices, I would say that we don't have science fiction there. We just have a performance of Hamlet, which is fine. I love Hamlet, but it's not science fiction. But in the case where the laser guns or the spaceships or the time machines or the replicants or the dystopian future city become more than props, become more than mere background, when they actually begin to transform the story and our relationship to the story, that's when we have science fiction. It doesn't necessarily need to be hard tech. It can be a soft science fictional development, like a social revolution, or a new set of political developments, or ecological disaster, which may be dealt with culturally as well as technologically. So it doesn't have to necessarily be hard science developments, but whatever this new thing is, science fiction scholars call it the novum. It has to really make a difference in the story. If we have that, then I think we have science fiction.
Cyberpunk is a subgenre of science fiction. Some of the defining features of it are that people in cyberpunk worlds mix the biological with the mechanistic, with the mechanical. One of the earliest instances of this would be William Gibson's Neuromancer. He invents the word cyberspace in this novel, for example, and it invents many of the tropes that we find over and over again in these types of works of literature and films, like the idea that we would insert a sort of physical mechanical device into our brains that would cause us to be able to insert our consciousnesses into the internet, as it were. And the way that Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and Blade Runner sort of mix this together, specifically Blade Runner, is that you're never quite certain in parts of the film who's actually a biological entity and who's actually a mechanical entity. It's very clever the way that the director mixed those things together, because it's very much the same in The Matrix. It's also very much the same in Neuromancer, that depending on which world you're in, whether you're in cyberspace or the real world, the entities that you're watching could be entirely mechanical or it could be entirely fleshly.
Cyberpunk as a literary genre and then later as a filmic genre picked up in the late 1970s and on into the 1980s, especially in US and British science fiction. And I think we can see cyberpunk as sort of a third wave of development. A first wave of development, let's say, is in the middle of the 20th century, the so-called Golden Age, when science fiction first gets a good idea of itself. Golden Age stories are very concerned with the power of technology and the power of new ideas to transform the world. It's fundamentally optimistic. It presents scientists as heroes. It presents technological development as wondrous. Then the second phase, let's say, is the New Wave, which dominates the 1960s and much of the 1970s. And in that era, there's a return to confusion, or a turn, let's say, not a return, but a turn to confusion, a turn to all the things that science cannot explain, a turn to all the ways that technology might harm us that are beyond our control, a return to unknowns. There's also at that time a diversification of character. Not all the protagonists are scientists. And there's a deepening of character. There's more of an interest not just in what scientists calculate and what they do, but on who people are and how they live. Let's say that cyberpunk then is actually sort of in the middle ground between Golden Age and New Wave. It's very interested in hard realities, both technological and sociological, but it retains that interest in character and in uncertainty that the Golden Age develops so much. Blade Runner does a superb job of taking some things that were already on the page in cyberpunk literature, both short stories and a few novels, and figuring out how to visualize those things, how to present them to us as a spectacle that we can think about. You can see in a fair amount of cyberpunk print fiction an attempt to evoke massive scale, the scale of new, heavily overcrowded cities, or just a scale of difference between the power that corporate CEOs wield and the much smaller amount of power that everyday people have. Blade Runner found a way to show us that, to think those thoughts in image form. And in that way, I think it's been very, very influential both for later science fiction and for cyberpunk writers, because seeing these concepts, seeing these questions of power and these questions of personhood portrayed visually definitely gave future cyberpunk writers, not just future cyberpunk filmmakers, a new stock of tactics for talking about some of the things that cyberpunk wanted to discuss. Blade Runner definitely is a story that follows that cyberpunk trend of focus on the power of the corporation. In a way, the corporation in Blade Runner is one of the novums, a hyper-powerful entity that apparently does not answer to government and that can do as it pleases, that can make or unmake people who believe they are human, and that basically has the police at its beck and call. This in a way is one of the novums of Blade Runner. And I think Blade Runner does a great job of insisting that the state of moral uncertainty and of intellectual uncertainty about whether or not I'm real that the character's going through, while that state could exist at any time in any society, it exists in a particular way in societies where corporations have become so incredibly powerful. So I think that the film is interested in looking at traditional issues of traditional noir issues or traditional philosophical issues of who am I and how can I know? How can I know if the world is a good place? How can I know if I can trust others? I think Blade Runner is interested in rethinking all those things with the idea that corporate power has transformed all of those traditional questions. Film noir is the filmic version, one might say, of the noir genre in general. And the way I see that genre is simply as a new development in the history of crime fiction, whether in print or on the screen, a new development in the history of crime fiction, and a new development in the history of the mystery as a genre. And if you want to keep it simple, you can say that there's a long period during which mysteries are thought of as solvable, both solvable in the sense that one can figure out who committed the crime, and solvable in the sense that one can derive meaning from that solution, that one can locate evil in the world, find the perpetrators who are the locus of that evil, confront them, dispose of them, etc. That one can solve the problem of justice or injustice. And noir, in a sense, is what you get when all those certainties are thrown into doubt. Noir is the world in which you don't always know who done it. Or once you find out, you're not sure if that's really the person who done it. Or even if you find that out, then you're not sure what that means, or whether or not the larger social evil that that person represents can be apprehended or not. So where the traditional mystery tried to bring a certain kind of certainty and reassurance, noir is basically what you get when what we're exploring is maximum confusion, both about what we know and about what we can do with what we know once we've located some particular crime.
Typically, noir would deal with sort of seamy underbellies of rundown cities, crime, a lot of sort of organized crime. Visually, conventions tend to be, as the name would suggest, black, dark, and so on. Blade Runner sort of uses noir conventions in a really smart way by adding in so much neon. So it has this black and steamy world that also has bits of glowing things in it that you wouldn't have seen in a classic film noir movie.
Why is noir so heavily shadowed? Because it's a way of talking about how the world is less knowable than we'd like to think. Why are there such strong contrasts in noir between sort of daylight environments where we see the world operating in an ordinary fashion that seems respectable and legitimate, and then nighttime or heavily shadowed environments where crime occurs and where we can see the visible evidence of corruption? Once we begin to understand how interested noir is in uncertainty, then we can begin to see why there's so much shadow in a noir film, and why there is such strong contrast between light and shadow, which in noir becomes a contrast between known and unknown, exposed or invisible. Also, you could say legitimate and illegitimate, straight and crooked. The official white picket fence world that thinks well of itself, and the underworld where different rules apply. This is also why noir is interested in smoke or mist, which obviously obscures vision and gives the eye more to do, and the perceptions more work to do in terms of determining an environment. Blade Runner, again, sort of science fictionalizes noir, and in this case what it does then is to ramp up some of noir's traditional aesthetic contrasts to a maximum degree. In Blade Runner, what we see is that the well-lit, quote-unquote, legitimate environment has basically been reduced only to high-rise penthouse apartments in large corporate buildings. There's no middle class in Blade Runner. There are only the people at the very top who have massive wealth and who obviously have political options for how to deal with difficulties that come up in their lives. The police seem to work at their behest. We have that world, that legitimate, incredibly powerful world, and then everyone else seems to be stuck in the misty, rain-soaked, underlit, neon-lit world that is below the level at which Tyrell operates. A lot of noir, traditional noir, doesn't really go vertically very much. It examines different zones that are kind of at the same level visually, but Blade Runner definitely has a strong vertical principle, as if to emphasize that we're talking about corporate power here. We're talking about the economic and political power that corporations and the heads of corporations wield. And so it's important for Blade Runner that Deckard has to go not just over to another part of town, so to speak, where City Hall is, but that he has to go up and up and up and up to get to where the Tyrells of the world live.
So Blade Runner bridges the gap between those two ostensibly different but very similar genre by just sort of showing how in the future there's still a very grimy city that runs on steam and is smoke and has poorly lit alleyways. The future has a criminal underground. It's not this shiny vision of the future that so many of the films from the 20s, say Fritz Lang's Metropolis, or even our sort of vision now of what the future might look. The Jetsons would be a great example, or something like the Google campus, right? Or these very futuristic images that we have, or images that we have of futuristic places. No, the future is dark. It's dirty. It's steamy. There are criminals everywhere. Murder is more or less rampant, and many of the problems of humanity have not been solved by technology, but caused by technology.
I think Blade Runner bridges the gap between noir and sci-fi by taking the tropes that we know well from noir and radicalizing them in a way that is impossible unless you bring some science fiction to bear. Here, the radical elements are the extreme contrast in terms of power and money between the upper class and everybody else, or the vanishing of the middle class. The dysfunctional nature of the city, which seems overcrowded in some areas and empty in others because of awful colonization. But above all, I think the main way that Blade Runner radicalizes noir is simply by introducing this idea of the replicant. I mean, if noir is naturally interested in what is legitimate and what is not legitimate, what we can know and what we can't know, then the question of who is a real person and how can I know if I'm a real person are perfect ways to sort of science fictionalize what noir ordinarily does.